I am here with a very, very interesting individual. He just came across my desk the other day, and I'm so happy that he took the time to sit down and speak with me today. I'm speaking with John Carter, and so a lot of you may know him from his very, very popular Substack, and that is barsoom.substack.com. That's Barsoom substack.com. Now, John, that's the main link I have for you. Did I miss out on any Twitters or anything else like that?
Yeah, I've got a Twitter at Martian Word Lord, like WYRD. And I'm on Telegram as well. You look for telegrams from Barsoom, you'll find me on there.
Oh, great. Perfect. I was actually trying to find your Telegram. I couldn't find it. But for people who want to know more about what the stuff we're going to talk about today, check out that Substack. There's a lot of good stuff on there. You publish pretty regularly, which is rare. And there seem to be quite a bit of comments that inspire discussion. And one thing we were just talking about, we were talking about an interesting phenomena. And if you'd like to delve into this again, we could, but it's about young men, especially who are raised by usually single mothers, and if those mothers tend to be political, let's say they're leftist, let's say they're feminist, yet the sons will kind of rebel against them later in life. I always found that an interesting phenomenon. And the thing I had heard recently, and this is kind of what I wanted your opinion on, was the name I keep hearing brought up, and you're not going to like this, but the name I keep hearing brought up is Andrew Tate. Now, I'm not a fan of Andrew. I'm not a fan, and we've reviewed him pretty poorly on the show before, but I'm not plugged into the world of Zoomers and Gen Alpha or whatever they're called. But I was surprised at how much Andrew Tate was popular with young people and how, they were just saying the based things, saying the anti-feminist things. Now, I was wondering, what do you think about that? And do you think there's a better model that kids could look at now that he's in jail, I guess?
No, there's a setup if I ever heard one. First, just let me say, thanks for having me on the show. This is really cool. I'm very happy to be here. So yeah, Andrew Tate. I won't pretend to know a whole lot about him. I think I first came across him maybe a couple years ago, and I was like, another Instagram influencer type, right? And so he says good stuff. And I think that explains part of the appeal that he has for the Zoomers. And he projects a very good image, right? He looks successful. He looks kind of cool. He's got hot ladies on his arm. And it's like, okay, what's not to like here? My sort of problem with the guy is that his lifestyle, his actions are not in alignment with what he says. So he's pushing back against the feminists, and he's telling young men to I guess the usual stuff, right? Lift weights, talk to girls, get rich, like all this stuff. Okay, this is all good stuff. I don't disagree. Become strong. This is the way. But then he makes money being a fucking e-pimp, whoring out cam girls to coomers, which, then, traps them in that porn cycle, turns them into fucking simps. And I don't know, maybe he'd rationalize that by saying, well, these people are going to be there anyways, and, might as well make my buck off of them. They aren't my audience. I don't know. I don't know enough about the guy, but it's like a heroin dealer kind of saying,
Yeah.
oh, I'm a pillar of the community. And he says a lot of great stuff. I'm pushing back against the man or whatever. But at the end of the day, it's you're dealing heroin there, man. This is some toxic shit.
Yeah. You know what's interesting? A couple points that I had thought of when I looked at Andrew Tate, because the first thing I saw when I looked at Andrew Tate, well, I thought a couple of things. One was that he doesn't look like a tough guy. And I know he can kickbox. And I know,
no.
but I think
I saw this great meme that someone was circulating, where they just had a picture of Andrew Tate and then kind of the computer mapping of his head. He's just Did you see this? It was so good.
He's a weird looking guy. He's got a goofy looking head. And the best comment I had heard, and I always try and bring this up to give credit, was by a guy I like named Mike Redbar. And he was one of the first guys to troll Andrew Tate back when he was just the guy who was sleeping with Jordan Peterson's daughter. And then he had said, this guy, he's got kind eyes. And I'm like, he does have kind eyes. That's why he wears shades all the time, because he actually doesn't have that look in his eyes that like a tough guy gets, you know? And I'm like, he
Right.
actually looks like kind of a dork guy. And then I saw him. I'm like, wow, this guy this is just Dick Masterson's bit. Because if anyone remembers Dick Masterson, he's still around. He's still got a show. But almost line for line, almost like when Dick Masterson was on Dr. Phil doing the exact same bit, but better and smarter and funnier, and he looked cooler. He's a bit older now, but I'm like, oh, this is. And it made me think like it seems like every decade, or I don't know how long Dick Masterson was around for, but we seem to get one of these guys always in circulation, because it made me think of like Andrew Dice Clay, and it made
Mm.
me think of like we always have these guys who they're a very strange version, almost a parody of masculinity, but they're always kicking around, and
I
I don't
guess
know
I
what to
guess
make
like
of
the
that.
best I guess like the best thing you could take away from that, if you want to take away something positive, is that dressing well, kids, and keeping yourself in reasonably good physical condition, having a basic sense of style will go a long way, even if you're a weird looking fucker like Andrew Tate. Um, you know,
Look, just wear the bomber jacket. A bomber jacket will take you miles.
exactly. But I think it's very similar to the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, right? So, you have this guy who's going out there and he's pushing back against the pronoun people, and he's saying all the right things about the woke left and all of this. And if you're like a 17-year-old and you're trapped in the government indoctrination factories and being emotionally tortured day in and day out by these deranged functionaries called teachers. Yeah. I mean, okay, you're in the digital longhouse, right? And like, all you're ever encountering are like vicious women and gamma male men. So anything that looks kind of like something that's not that and says that stuff is bad, you're going to be like, oh, this is my hero. But then, okay, but what's actually behind it, you know? Um, so yeah, I mean, that was kind of one of the things that got me to write that piece on tonic masculinity,
I wanted to
which is
get to
kind of
that too, because it's a very, very good post. So we can get into that right now if you'd like to, because I had some
yeah,
stuff to
sure.
say about that.
I mean, there's a lot. That was a long article. There's a lot in there, and I didn't even say everything that I really wanted to say. But I mean, it's kind of it is kind of a cheesy name, like, um, but obviously it's a play off of toxic masculinity, this term which has just been kind of like force memed into the culture over the last decade or so. Like everyone hears it all the time, and like there's never any sort of like counterpoint to toxic masculinity. It's just like there's toxic masculinity, which is all the bad things, and then there's masculinity. And okay, well, what's toxic masculinity then? Well, usually it's sort of, I don't know, like being assertive, being being a man essentially. And of course, there are all sorts of ways that you can express any trait that you have in a negative or a positive fashion. But the problem is that when you only have a word or a term, like a conceptual hook for the negative stuff, and then you have a term for something which is neutral, like masculinity on its own, it's just neutral. Um, it's difficult to separate the positive and the negative. You can't disaggregate them. And that
No,
means
I agree
that
completely. Yeah.
somewhat inevitably all of the negative traits and get sort of mixed in with the positive traits and vice versa. So on the left, like they'll basically say like, anything masculine is toxic. It's all bad, right? And the results of that are all of these gamma males that you see running around, guys cutting their dicks off. I mean, the bit. We all know the bit, right? But then something that we don't think about maybe as much as we should on the right is the flip side of that, where there's a tendency to sort of say, okay, anything that's not that is good, right? And it's like, okay, so in a pure vitalist sense, like it's probably better to be strong than weak. Like I'm totally there with that. But that lack of discernment, separating out like the good and the bad, uh, it leaves the door open for people like Andrew Tate. as kind of the canonical example here, where like this guy, like I said before, he's just a fucking pimp. And not even a cool pimp with actual prostitutes. It's a fucking e-pimp. It's like the lowest of the low, right? Um, and then he suddenly becomes this voice of this guru of masculinity to young men who then get sucked into this weird world of going out, like, signing up for his hustler you and learning how to be e-pimps themselves or whatever the fuck it is. And it's like,
And anyone who runs an online course is suspect, in my opinion.
it depends, like if I see like a guy like Ed Dutton, if I see a guy like Ed Dutton, for instance, who's like legit, like actual academic, and he's like, I will teach you about evolutionary biology. It's like, this is probably fine. Right. But the life coach types who are like, I will teach you how to be a man. It's like, like look carefully. Andrew Tate is not the only one. But of course, on the other hand, on the other side of that, though, I mean, there is this gaping need in our culture because like every single institution that we had, and we used to have quite a few of them for turning boys into men. The Boy Scouts is now just the Scouts, right? Because girls had to be let in. And gays. So, put your son in Boy Scouts.
That caused a lot of problems.
Oh, you mean they're bankrupt now because of all the lawsuits over totally not pedophile homosexuals, getting access to 14-year-old boys?
Because years ago, someone said, hey, if you let those guys in, they're going to molest your kids. And they said, shut up. And now here, the most obvious things in the world keep happening. And then, but there's no I told you so moment. It just sucks now forever.
Oh, the Boy Scouts, what happened to them is just tragic, man. I mean, like, I think they tried to push back on the letting gays be scout leaders thing, and were told like that's a civil rights violation. So like you'll get sued into the dirt if you don't let them in. So they were kind of like they had their arm twisted. They had to let them in. Next thing you know, little boys getting molested, and now they got a class action lawsuit. I mean, it was a catch-22, right?
Yeah.
And this kind of thing has happened just to every institution, the military, right? Like, you join like the infantry and you've got women all over the place. I've got nothing against women, but you cannot have a male bonding system. You cannot turn boys into men when you have a bunch of females running around. It just doesn't work because it changes the social dynamics entirely. And just, the examples go on and on and on. There are basically no formal institutions left to do that. And then making it even worse is that a huge number of I almost use the word men, adult human males in our society don't even recognize that this is a problem.
Now, I wanted to say one thing. But at the start of this, you had said that the phrase tonic masculinity you thought was a bit cheesy. I disagree. I think it's actually a very good term. And I'll tell you why it's a good term, in my opinion, at least. Because I was just this evening, there's a big conflagration going on right now about the term cultural Marxism and whether that's valid and whatnot.
Yeah. That's been going for that's a perennial thing.
Yeah. But the reason my thing is that if we try to make words popular and kind of go into the zeitgeist, I don't like having to teach people a whole bunch of new terms. And this is why, one example would be this character named No White Guilt, who's a lovely guy, but he came up, he was pushing this term biospirit. And I'm like, I don't. What? It kind of, instead of like, instead a new way to look at race, it's your biological spirit. I'm like, it's too complicated. We don't have the time to teach people.
Soul, basically.
Yeah. So it's like you can't keep teaching the public new words and then reteaching them every once in a while. So tonic masculinity kind of worked for me because, they've been taught toxic masculinity. So this is just a little bit of an inversion. I'm like, that
right,
would
and
work.
This is kind of the idea, right? It's like they see when they see it the first time, like their brains will kind of go, toxic masculinity, and then they'll look more closely. Oh wait, tonic. Oh, and then. Because, what does tonic mean? Well, your gin and tonic. A tonic is something that helps you take your medicine, protects you against malaria, quinine. It kind of wakes you up, revivifies you, brings life into your body. Actually, Harrison Coley, who's one of the other kind of like neo gonzo substackers that I hang around with, he has a really, really fascinating substack called Ponerology. So PON.
Oh yeah, no, we covered that on the show. There's this book,
Oh,
Political
cool.
Ponerology. Yeah,
Yeah. That's okay. Good for you. I read about that the first time. I read Lobachewski's book. Oh man, like over a decade ago, and I've been telling people about that for years now. I think that's one of the most important ideas to get out there is like the role played by psychopathy in society. I'm really glad. And I've noticed it started to like catch on more the last like year or so. And I'm really happy about that.
yeah.
So yeah,
We
he
read
had a
that
really
book, and
good,
I was gonna say we read that book and we paired it with Spiteful Mutants by Edward Dunn because those go right
oh
hand in hand, I
yes.
think.
Yeah. No, that's exactly. Yes. that's they go together very, very well. So yeah, Harrison had a good piece riffing on the tonic masculinity idea, uh, sort of going into the etymology of tonic and uncovering some things I didn't know actually. Like for instance, it actually is related to tension as well, which is kind of cool. Uh, so the cultural Marxism. Just one thing that I would say on that is probably one of the most common objections that I hear raised to the use of that term by guys in our sphere is this kind of autistic complaint that these people aren't really Marxists. And
Yeah,
that's true. They're not. I mean, there's an intellectual heritage that goes back to Marxism. Um, and and that could lead to like the James Lindsay mistake of like, if I just explain it well enough, it will go away. No, it won't. It doesn't work like that.
yeah,
But on the other hand, like the sort of that's one kind of autism, and then the other kind of autism is they're not really Marxists. And it's like, okay, they're not, but that doesn't matter. We're talking rhetoric here, and at a rhetorical
yeah.
level, North Americans, particularly conservative-minded North Americans, meaning the vast majority of white people, especially, they don't have any deep thoughts about what Marxism is. They haven't read Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto or any of this, right? They just know Marxist equals commie equals bad, right? Like it's just that's it. It serves the same function on the right that the word fascist serves on the left, right? Like when they call us fascists, they're not saying that we are believers in the unity of state and corporation, according to a certain Italian strongman in the 1920s and 30s. Like they don't even probably know that history themselves, right? It just means bad person, right? And like
Yeah, we're the
Marxist essentially
historical
is the same
bad
shit.
guys.
Yeah, it's historical bad guy, right? So like an American hears Marxist or a Canadian for that matter, and they think Cold War, they think commie, they think like subversive KGB agent, right? And well, frankly, the subversive agent part does describe what these people do pretty well, frankly. Um, and they'll also might have like images in their heads of the sort of like hideous historical catastrophes like what happened in Cambodia under Pol Pot. um, and again, like if this current version of the globalist corporatist left really gets their way, I think we all kind of see the gulags coming down the pike in the future, right? Like, so like not that they want to exterminate us. I don't, because I think like that's one thing that you don't try to exterminate like 60-70% of the population or whatever. I mean, maybe breed us out very slowly over a period of like a century, but like more like they want to turn us into helots, and we're kind of already there, to be honest.
Yeah, I know we're jumping around a bit because this is something I wanted to get to later, but we're on the topic now, and we'll get back to tonic masculinity in a second. But you had published a piece, I think, just a few days ago on this topic of the words, and what I liked was you started off by saying, "I want to find my new nuclear word." And I think you were talking about
Yes.
cultural Marxism. It's like it kind of works, kind of doesn't, but I want a word that makes the person I'm using it against really feel humiliated and bad. And I have one, but I'm going to talk about yours because you had settled on Marxists. Did you want to speak on that for a
Yes.
second?
Yes. So yeah, I went through like all the slurs that have been come up with over the last several years. Social justice warrior, which I don't really like because calling someone a warrior, I mean, look at these fucking people. It's just a category error. Like
Yeah,
even if
yeah.
you're using it ironically, it's sort of like Snowflake. I mean, that was always a bit lame, but George Takei kind of ruined that.
Now they just
Um,
use it on us wrongly.
it's cringe when they use it, but like it can't be used anymore. That's the problem. Yeah. And it doesn't really, it's just this whole idea that like, oh, they want to be special, unique. It's like, no, they actually don't. They're highly conformist. Like for all the neo pronouns and xeno pronouns and shit, like they're very conformist people. And there's a bunch of others like, and the problem with a lot of them, like cry bully, for instance, which okay, like that describes very effectively a tactic that they use, but it doesn't say anything about their inner nature, really. So the one that came to me just when I was in the comments threads of Chris Bray's Substack, he's a pretty funny guy. He's not like 100% like sort of. He's older, right? So he's kind of a boomer, but he's pretty funny. His heart's in the right place. I love his blog. Anyhow, um, it just kind
So
of
can
like
you
came
say
to me when
say
I was
his
like,
what's his blog's name again, just so people can check it out?
tell me how this ends. He gets boosted on Revolver now and then. I owe the guy a debt of honor because he recommended my blog when in the early days. And I picked up like 400 subscribers from that. So um, yeah, no, it really gave me a nice boost at the beginning, promotion. But yeah, so the word that I came up with is Marxist, a portmanteau of Marxist and narcissist. The Marxist part is, well, I mean, like, partly it's taken a shot at their own sort of self-image as being these like revolutionaries for social justice or whatever, which is, forgetting for a second what I just said about they're not really being Marxists. It's kind of got, they do kind of see themselves as revolutionaries. Um, and then the narcissist part is it's obvious. These people are all mentally fucking ill. They brag about being mentally ill. They're proud of being. They put it in their bios, like I'm bipolar and like borderline or depressed or neurodivergent. But they're also very fucking sensitive about that. It's like
They
so.
are. It's funny. I always want to say I also have my own nuclear term, which some people may think sounds very reductive, but it feels good, and I just like saying it. I say gay communist. And for a couple of reasons, and people say, "Oh, well, they're not really communists," but that's the point. It doesn't really fucking matter. We already kind of established that the people you're trying to craft these words for, they already kind of know what communist is, and that already has the negative social capital attached to it. Because even Marxists are scared of being called communists. And then here's the other great thing you notice with people: I don't care what you are politically. If you're a straight man, you don't want to be called gay. Call
No,
someone a
no.
gay communist, they will immediately get upset. I promise you. It's the damnedest thing.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. That'll get under their skin very quickly. Yeah, yeah. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I mean, shit. Like Seinfeld was making fun of that back in like the '90s.
It's like no girl actually wants to be called fat. I remember when Amy Schumer, she's like the fat activist, and she was like, oh, so the press was like, oh, and here she is in a size 8. It's like, oh, I love fat people, but I'm a size 1 actually. Like queen of fat bitches, the big bitch queen doesn't actually want to be seen as fat deep down. I'm like, we can play around with that. That's a big sandbox to invite everyone into.
It's like you were talking the other day about on your podcast about what would piss them off more, using AI to make the ugly girl pretty by making her not fat, or making the pretty girl ugly by making her fat. And like, I'm pretty
It's
sure
such a
it's
good
the
troll.
former. I'm pretty sure it's the former. Like if you make the like pretty girls, I mean they're a little self conscious, but if you kind of especially, but if you sort of like show like use the filter to add 300 pounds as like a troll, like a lot of them will probably just roll their eyes, right? They probably get more butthurt about like deep fake porn or something, but like the fat girl being made pretty, like I think that would be like a kick in the box, you know, like just it would just
It's so effective. It feels evil. But there's this guy, this online character, a lol cow by the name of Patrick S. Tomlinson. I'm not going to go into the whole lore on him, but some people might know who I'm talking about. But there's this great troll. He's this kind of a shitty sci-fi writer, and he's fat and he's mean and he's a shit lib. But people started doing this thing, and it was so good to seem cruel, where they started photoshopping him to be handsome and taking his angry tweets and making them seem like chill, cool tweets. I'm like, damn, that must be to see yourself in your idealized form is really and knowing that you'll probably never get there. I'm like, that's maddening almost, right?
you know, if it could give someone a prod by like seeing like, oh wait, I could be that, and I think it would have that effect on some. You guys were talking about that as well. I think that would have that effect on some people. On others, I think it might just destroy them. You know, if they realize like, you know, like, oh, I could be that, but I don't have the willpower to do it. Yeah, yeah. Like
It's interesting
it.
because like it is an ideal that you instinctually want, but your ideology demands that you not admit internally that that's an ideal. So you're always short circuiting. That's what the shit lib goes through. It's like nothing's wrong with being fat, but that's like that they need to keep convincing themselves that that idealized version isn't better, and that
Oh, yeah,
drives you crazy.
it's the tranny thing, right? This is why they're so insistent that everyone reinforce their delusions that they're really a pretty girl and not a dude in a wig who hasn't shaved in 3 days. Like it's it's this very fragile, like they need to maintain this illusion that there's something they're not. They know it's fake. Their entire worldview would come crashing down around them if it was pointed out to them that like, no, actually you are living in a delusion. None of this is real. You know, big is not beautiful. You are not healthy. Like you should probably lose weight. Like, you know, this would be emotionally crushing to them. However, sometimes you need to be mean because they might need that. It's like tough love, essentially. Like it's not actually evil to bully someone a little bit into getting their shit together. People look at like Asian girls. Look at Asian girls, right? Like the ones from Asia, like you know, East Asia. I mean, not like India. And you know, they're predominantly quite skinny. Why is this? I mean, partly it's diet. You know, they're not guzzling HFCS like you know North American girls are. But partly it's cultural. They're ruthless with each other. One of them puts on like 1 pound. All of her girlfriends are like, you know, when they go out for like lunch or something, they're like, "Oh, you're looking a little. Have you thought about salad?" You know, like it's they keep each other in line, and the result is that like they all look pretty, and the result of that is they're generally happier.
And you know what's interesting is I think you just touched on something very good there with discussing the whole trans issue, because and this is a great example of tonic masculinity or tonic masculinity versus toxic masculinity, because on the trans issue you had just said like bullying and being a little bit mean is actually better. You do it because you care, despite what they may think. You do it because you care, and that would be a tonic masculine thing. Now, a toxic masculinity, a masculine man would just laugh as these women are raped and molested by trannies. And
Yes,
that's to this day,
exactly.
like we actually, that's not a level of cruelty. I think I say this about people on the right broadly. It's like, if you just knew how many sweethearts are over here, how many just like nice, cool guys, like they're not people who are celebrating torture. And the example I would give is like, you know, take the most extreme white supremacist, and I know a few big fans of the show, but you know, a few of them, like I've never seen them laugh at a black baby suffering. If they see a black person
No.
abusing a black child, they're upset. They're viscerally pissed off. That's gross. That's disgusting. How dare they? Whereas you see some people laugh at a white baby being abused, and that's a level of cruelty I don't think any of us really approach, and I think that's good and good enough to point out. But
Hmm.
that's the difference between a toxic masculinity of, yeah, you get what you fucking deserve, haha, and you're laughing at a woman being raped, which is, I'm like, I don't think most people, the masculine men over here, really want to see that. Some people
No,
will
and
like
like
say it ironically, but
you'll see, yeah, exactly. Like people will like joke, like, you know, when like some fucking outrage happens over in Europe, for instance, with you know, migrants having their way with the Swedish women who, you know, happily invited them in or something. Like, oh, well, you know, you get what you deserve. But that's on the internet, right? Like that's a way of coping. Frankly, it's gallows humor because it's just so fucking grim. But if you were to like be there in person, like, no, most people would try and do something, you know. Um, I had a piece shortly after I started the blog, kind of touching on this stuff, like sort of how I think about, you know, these issues, and the title was something like, "Just because you're smarter than dogs doesn't mean you can kick them." And sort of my sort of point there, I think it's implicit in the title, right? It's like, and there's this idea that has a lot of currency on the left. It's one of the reasons, I think it's the reason, that they're so allergic to any sort of, like, you know, HBD, frankness, race realism, call it what you will, especially anything related to like IQ or behavior. Um, that, you know, if these things were real, then we'd have to, I don't know, like exterminate them or something, right? Like Hitler was right, so we have to kill everyone. And it's like, yeah, no, it doesn't work that way, you know, like. And the example is like, okay, are humans smarter than dogs? Like, quite obviously, you know. Does that mean you can walk around torturing dogs? Like, no, that doesn't follow. Like, you still should be nice to dogs. You should still treat them well and help them be the best dogs they can be, because that's just the humane fucking thing to do. So it's really the same when it comes to, like, you know, relations between human groups. It's like, are there going to be differentials in IQ, or some groups going to be more um, prone to violent outbursts, or have, you know, a higher time preference than others, or, you know, whatever the usual things. And it's like, yeah, like, obviously that's going to be the case, and we can see it. Um, does that mean you should treat them badly? No, doesn't.
yeah.
Like,
And a good point is, like, I used to say this years ago when I try and explain this to women too, to try and help them out. I explain this to young men too, where I'm like, you know, like, what do women want? Well, you know, you get old enough, you know exactly what women want. But if I have to explain it, I'd be like, you know what, women like confidence. Now, there's a couple ways to do confidence. You can be a dick. Being a dick and an asshole is kind of low resolution confidence. A lot of young guys default to that because they don't know how to do the higher resolution version of confidence, which is kind of what we're talking about with toxic masculinity. So now, women will say, like, I don't like dealing with assholes, but they will choose that asshole over a weak man 10 times out of
yes,
10. You see it every single
every
fucking
time,
day.
every time,
And
every time.
but
Because like,
they would prefer
because no
the
matter
confident,
what,
but
yeah, no, strength is always better than weakness, right? Like, you know, being a gamma male is not the way to win over women. Being a sociopath is actually better than being a gamma male for romantic success, quite frankly.
yeah.
But it's hardly ideal either. Like, most women, if they're not fucking broken themselves, given the choice between like the sociopath who's going to cheat on her and like beat her or whatever, and the sort of like a strong guy who asserts himself but also treats her like a human being, is probably going to prefer the latter option. But, you know, that's I think, especially when you're young and you haven't been given those examples, you just sort of, all you can do is veer between these extremes, and finding that sort of happy median. uh, it's tricky. You know, this is why, of the classical virtues, there's a good argument to be made that temperance is actually the most important one, right? Like, you know, people often, they hear temperance and they just think, oh, don't drink too much, right? That's what that means. It's like, no, it means moderation, as in finding that sort of perfect path between the two extremes, both of which have the danger, like their own dangers, right? Like, and this applies to like the other virtues. So like, Prudence, for example. So if you are too prudent, this can turn into cowardice. You're paralyzed with indecision all the time. And of course, if you're not prudent at all, then you're just going to be a fucking retard and do stupid shit all the time, hurt yourself and others. Both of these are bad. Having that kind of middle ground of prudence, where you're being just careful enough, but also just reckless enough, right? This is the way to go. Similarly with relations with women, like you have to be a man about it. You have to be assertive. You have to be confident, but you also don't want to be a dick.
Yeah, and not be so ridiculous. And this comes with age as well, because being a dick, that's okay if you're like 16 to your maybe mid 20s is even pushing it. There was this fucking joke I saw by one of my favorite comedians, Shane Gillis, and he was at a roast of one of the hosts of Legion of Skanks, Louis J. Gomez. He's talking about another comedian named Ari Shafir, Jew, but he's like this kind of like edgy comic, and then he's up there, and he's just the way he says it's great. I'm gonna butcher it, but he's like, Ari Shafir is a really dangerous and edgy guy, which is really cool for a 50-year-old guy to be. And I heard that, I'm like, that's fucking true. Like, if you're just being like a edgy 22-year-old when you're 50, that's a weird fucking look, right? You're just, I'm the guy who says fucked up shit when you could be like a grandfather. I'm like, if that's all you are, again, low resolution sort of guy to be.
It's it's definitely something that comes with age, right? Like, I sort of feel like you don't want to ever totally lose that edge. It's a matter of knowing when to use it, right? Like, I think this is like really key actually to the whole tonic notion. It's like you have your tools, right? And you want to have as many tools as you can, but you also want to know like how to use the tools and when to use the right tool for the right job. So, there are times when you want to use the word fuck, and you will get like maximum effect from the use of that word. If you're just saying fuck, 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 fuck all the time, kind of loses its meaning, right? I think there is a tendency sometimes as guys get older, they like, rather than keeping that knife in their back pocket, so to speak, and knowing when to pull it out, they just let it get dull, and then they forget, they leave it at home, and then they don't have it at all, which is very sad in its own way.
It's funny. This brings us back to, I guess, where we started by talking about Andrew Tate and pimps specifically. And I wanted to mention this, that I think pimps as a social phenomena, they're a perfect example of what we're talking about, because even growing up, I guess Snoop Dogg was big about this, but like popularizing the pimp as like a cool character. But pimps always seemed really stupid and lame to me. And I see guys now are like, oh, I'm a former pimp, but I'm on a podcast. There's a guy on fucking No Jumper named Sharp or something. He's like a former pimp, but they all look like and talk like and act like cartoon characters. I'm like, you guys are so fucking gay.
When I was a teenager, like the whole gangster rap hip hop thing kind of baffled me, because like I looked at someone like Snoop Dogg and I was like, this guy's a fucking clown. Frankly, like, and like, meanwhile, okay, who were my heroes, right? John Carter, who were you looking to? And I'm like, well, like Captain Picard, Conan the Barbarian, like, these were the kinds of like, like fictional characters. I mean, frankly, Snoop Dogg is a fictional character too. He just plays himself, but it's all a LARP. These were the guys that I was looking at, and like, Picard, he's like dignified and fatherly and wise, but he's like, he's also firm and decisive. He takes everything into account, all factors, and then like takes exactly the right action in order to like, achieve the objective with like, generally like the minimum amount of like damage that he can get away with. And then you have Conan, who's just like, raw vril, basically. Which has a lot to recommend it as well. But like, some drug smoking pimp slapping hoes around. I'm like, okay,
Yeah,
like,
well, because the pimp, it's like, okay, you're a grown man, you're gonna dress like a spoiled boy prince, and you only beat up women. I'm like, this sounds like a gay thing to be. Like,
yeah,
when did this ever
yeah,
become cool?
yeah, exactly. Like, this is not terribly impressive, you know? Like, it's why you don't fight. You don't fight girls because there's no physically. I mean, because like there's no upside to it, right? Like, if you lose the fight, you got beaten by a girl, and if you win the fight, you beat up a girl. Like, I mean, like either way, you lose. Which is, this is part of the problem with the mass influx of females into all of the male spaces, which, male spaces rely to a huge degree on sort of friendly contention, in order to sort out the hierarchy uh, and well, mainly that actually. But there's no glory in beating the woman. So then it kind of like puts guys on their back feet all the time because they don't want to push too hard, right? Um, and then you end up with all of these guys who are their bodies have been trained at this kind of like neuro emotional level that, as my friend Jay Rollins put it, like, normal male aggression means bad doggy. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's, yeah, yeah, um,
I just want to say you mentioned Picard there, and I think Picard is not usually brought up enough as a very good, I guess, male role model to have, especially if you pair him with Conan, because they're kind of opposites in that sense.
oh
But
yeah,
I don't think I'm out of turn when I say that Picard would be a stoic. And that was kind of what
oh,
his character was about, which is that he never gets emotional. He's always just right down the line. And there's never a big ending where he cries or confesses his secret, which is
it's
what the
not
new Picard
totally
show
that's
is.
not totally true. There were some episodes, like I think the end of the Locutus two part. I think there's a bit of a tear there, and it's very emotionally affecting. And there's a couple of others that come to mind. In general, you're right. He's extremely in control of his emotions. Um, so when he does show emotion, you're like shit. Like, it really hits you in the gut. Um,
Yeah, but he's like almost the coolest version of just a steely rationalist. But then you've also got Conan. If you could be both those guys at the same time, you're set.
Knowing when to be one or the other. I mean, there are different paths, right? Like, there's no one way to be a fully realized man, like, who's like on the path. But there are much worse paths than others. I
And
had something
there's one
else to
thing.
say there, but go.
No,
Yeah.
it's okay. But there's bunch of stuff I wanted to ask you about, and this will be an interesting time to ask because you'd mentioned something there about women in the workplace and men feeling that they need to kind of change how they behave and whatnot. And I wanted to, if you're willing, perhaps get a bit into your past in academia, as was outlined on your blog, and kind of what led to where you are now. We don't need to go into too much detail if you don't want to, but it's an interesting story. And to lead into that, I was going to say that my experience in the professional world, for people who don't know, I used to work in kitchens and restaurants as like a sous chef and a line cook at various points, and then I've been in marketing for over around 10 years now, not over, but around 10 years, I think. And I find that working around women, because marketing, the entire industry, especially in Canada, if I had to estimate, it would be over half women. So I have a lot of experience working around women, having women in leadership, being in a company culture where women are in charge of things and the female norms run rampant. And I find that over time, it has affected me. I've had to consciously fight back while adapting the fake persona that I need to exist in that world while keeping
Hmm.
the real me here. But I do fear that on a long enough timeline, I am getting worn down more and more just by having to live in that fucking prison and saying, not to use this word too much, the gayest things imaginable. You need to do that. You need to make small talk every day and say TGIF and make puns. If you're in an office, you need to be punny. And that does horrible damage to the male psyche. Saying a pun, anyway. But I think your experience in academia is the same.
I will say that the much maligned dad joke is actually a flex because the only person laughing is you, and you're
Yeah,
laughing at everyone else's discomfort. So it's actually
that's
quite
true.
alpha to make the dad joke. But I know exactly what you mean. So I mean, my field is one of the few STEM fields that is um, it's not majority female, but like there's a lot of women, and for the most part, they're actually quite pleasant to be around. It's very much the head girl archetype, as Dutton would put it. They're conscientious, and they're friendly, and they work hard, and all of these things. But you find yourself walking on eggshells all the time because they have
Absolutely.
feelings. And if you criticize them a little bit too hard, you hurt their feelings and then they cry. So you don't want to do that because it's annoying. So then you don't do that. And you start adopting um, this rather than trying to find what's wrong about what they did, you try to find what's right about what they did. As There was a philosopher who described it. That was the official policy that was adopted in his philosophy department, which replaced the far more contentious atmosphere they would have in seminars before it became, largely dominated by women. Uh, and like then like they'll do their little female social aggressions on you, like if you so a lot of the times, for instance, maybe I'm excitable, and if I'm talking about something, or if a topic comes up that I'm like really interested in and like I know about it, like I have a hard time stopping myself from just jumping in and like talking about it, right? I think a lot of sort of like somewhat autistic guys are like that on things they're interested in. So when you do that and you're told every time, stop mansplaining, it's like it starts getting to you because you start training yourself to not do this thing which comes very naturally to you, and then you're biting your tongue all the time. And then of course they have their opinions, which are shitty because they're always shitty. But they, as shitlib girls especially, like they don't see why they shouldn't throw their opinions out there on things like diversity, inclusion, and equity, for instance, or why Trump is a bad orange man. Um, and they expect you to clap when they say it. And sort of the only way I was able to sort of deal with that, because in the academic environment, you couldn't be like, actually, Trump is, he kept most of his promises or whatever, right? Because that's going to be the end for you if you do it. So I would just my only tactic was just to not respond, to just like deny them the expected chuckle at the weak joke about the bad orange man, for example. And then it would be awkward for a few seconds, and we could get back to talking about fucking work. Uh, but I would even see this kind of thing happen during like academic talks, like at conferences. You would get like the shitlibs who would, and the guys too, who are spiritually women, uh, would like they'd like open their talk with like some dig at Republicans or whatever, um, and kind of expect everyone to laugh. And of course, all the shitlibs in the audience like, ha ha, ha, that's so funny. And then like the small number of conservatives would be kind of like just kind of like sitting there, But it never occurs to these fucking people that, like, first of all, massively unprofessional. Like, why are you doing this? We're not here to talk about politics. We're here to talk about like a technical subject. And second, like, what about the people who don't agree with you, right? Like, that's why the conservatives in the audience that's one of the reasons we're not fucking doing that, because like we're there to be professional and they're not. which is one of the issues with female psychology, especially, is that they had an extremely difficult time separating the political and the personal. They don't do, when it comes to people, they don't do abstract reasoning really at all. So, like, Dutton, God, that's like the third time he's been mentioned in this interview. You think I listened to him a lot or something? He had a recent piece talking about.
Don't worry, I end up doing the same thing because he's one of the few guys I always keep listening to, and he comes up because there's not a lot of people talking about this sort of thing from an evolutionary biological. J.F. Garepi would be another, but it's kind of
Yeah,
those two I can think of.
yeah, exactly. And he's almost invariably got something interesting to say. So and he had a recent one talking about midwit arguments, and one of them was that, like, is the argument um, that where you'll say, like, I have noticed that many X are like Y, which makes me think that Z may be true. And then the midwit will come back and say, well, actually, my friend A, who is X, is not like Y. So Z is certainly not true, right? Like, it's this inability to separate the particular from the statistical, um, from the general. And women do this all the time. Because everything, because, like, if people are involved, it becomes personal to them. They're unable to abstract things. And that ties into, like, their way of interacting in the office, where, like, they have a really hard time, like I said, like, separating out criticism of their professional work from criticism of them as a human being, and, like, admittedly, like, I'm not saying that this is like men are totally one way and women are totally another way. I mean, there's huge amounts of overlap. That was a struggle for me as well when I was first learning how to do that stuff. That, like, my supervisor would come back and, like, hand me, like, my a paper I've been working on, and it's covered in red ink, and they rephrase this and that's wrong, and and I'd be like, oh, you kind of bridle, like, how dare you? But then, like, I'd have to, like, remind myself, okay, like, he's not being a jerk, like, he's trying to make sure that my work is as good as possible. And then I'd kind of, like, bite back that offense that I would take, and just fucking do it. Whereas women, you have to be a lot more careful because they're much more likely to cry and then hold it against you for the rest of your life.
That is my
So,
experience when I was at an agency, and I was curious. Was this? I'm referring to article I'm looking at that you published called "Lay Down and Let It Rot," about
oh
your
yeah.
experiences in the academic world, which you had just recently. You had some problems in America, and I was wondering, was this phenomena one of the contributing reasons why you had such a contentious relationship with academia? And if you wouldn't mind, would you be willing to kind of explain a bit about your history going through the academic system, being a post grad, and all that stuff? Because I think it's very fascinating. I think it's important to the story as well.
So, man, I wrote that. I was in a mood, and so I don't actually specifically remember everything that I said in there. I sort of remember the general gist of it. So, to be clear, it's not like I got canceled or something like that. I sort of reached the end of a contract postdoctoral fellowship, that when I started it, it was like for a defined term, right? So it's not like I got fired or something like that. It was really more just like, trying to find a job, uh, as, like, move on to the next stage in my career, which that job had supposed to have been like a stepping stone kind of thing. And I did, I think, reasonably well at it. Most of my peers, when they would see my CV, they'd be like, "Oh wow." The professors, and the older professors I knew, would be like, "Oh yeah, you'll shoe in. You should be fine." And then, of course, in the post Summer of Love explosion of bureaucracy and diversity hiring initiatives, because
Oh, let
you
me
need the
just say
professoriate
for
to,
people who know, DIE means diversity, inclusion, and equity. It's a very
yeah,
I
yeah.
like to use that. That's a very good term.
Yeah, I refuse to use the more commonly encountered DEI, because that is a little bit too close to the Latin for God, which I do not think is accidental. I think there's some NLP going on there for sure. And then of course, I've noticed that there's people who say EDI, which and it's funny because this maps very well to like people's politics. So like, the sort of Marxists, the woke, they all go with DEI. The sort of hardcore opponents who just DGAF will say die. And you're sort of the ones who are still trying to chart the middle path will say EDI because it's a bit more bloodless and bureaucratic. But yeah, departments all over North America now are hell bent on um, making sure that the professoriate resembles the world we live in today. So you have to have, for instance, 50% female representation, which, because of course the boomer portion of the professoriate, which is easily half of it, is pretty much exclusively old white dudes. And they're not going anywhere until they fucking die. They're holding onto those jobs with white knuckled grips. So the only way to achieve that balance is to really um, preferentially hire people from historically disadvantaged minority groups. Predominantly females, because let's face it, you don't actually get that many blacks who are even able to complete grad school in the more difficult disciplines. And Asians don't quite qualify as diverse these days. They're sort of it's actually kind of funny how that worked out. Really, like the alt right joking about the Asians being like honorary Aryans like back in like 2015, and that was like a meme. And like then like it seems like the left kind of like picked that up in the last couple of years, but which I think we all saw it coming because it's bio-Leninism, right? And like Asians are actually competent, so of course. Uh,
Yeah.
But yeah, so I sort of like, I found myself like at the end of the summer, just kind of like, okay, well, I haven't actually found a position yet. Well, this is shit. And I just, I could either have stayed in my extraordinarily expensive apartment in the US with an income of $0, or I could give away all of my furniture, leave the apartment, and, come and stay with family for a while. So I was like, well, I'll save a lot of money doing that, so fuck it. And yeah, I mean, the one thing that I do remember writing in that particular piece was that what kind of gets me with the DIE stuff is that they will use, when you point out to them that this is like just open racial and sexual discrimination, and God, I feel so fucking gay putting it in those terms. It's like I'm whining, I'm using their language. But like when you point that out to them, like they'll usually retort, well, that's just to make up for historical inequities because, back in the past, women were discriminated against and black people were discriminated against. So we have to have, as per like Ibram X. Kendi, like, positive discrimination now or whatever to make up for it. And the thing is, if you look at it historically, back in like say 1920 or something, right? So like everyone likes to bring up, for instance, the example of like someone like Mary Curie, who had to like fight to break the glass ceiling and such before her research killed her from cancer. And but the thing is, she did get accepted. Why? Because the reason that women, for example, were excluded from the sciences was because the general opinion back then was, well, we don't really think you can do it. So, like we're kind of skeptical that you can. But if a woman came along and she proved that actually, no, she can, play poker at the big boys table, then the guys would just be like, well, okay, yeah, yeah, sure. Like, I guess you can play. Because the focus was on the discipline. It was on, the activity, right? So like once you demonstrated that actually, no, you can do this, you were in. Whereas what is happening now is much more, they're sort of like, well, we don't care if you can do it. And I think that's way worse because it's like, yeah, we don't care if you can do it, you still can't do it. And we don't care if this other person can't do it, we're going to give them the job anyways. And the result of that, of course, is that the institutions are filling up with incompetent midwits, uh, and they are hemorrhaging prestige as a result of that. The universities are increasingly a fucking joke, and people just openly acknowledge that fact more and more. There's every year fewer 18-year-olds even choose to go to university because they're like, they don't like the value isn't so obviously there. A larger fraction of the population just tunes out everything that comes out of academia. And I kind of feel that, like, if you come back in 10 years, maybe not, it won't even take that long. It's like, yeah, the woke left will own the universities. That won't change, but they will reign over a kingdom of ashes. It won't matter that they own it because it won't have any prestige. And with no prestige, there will be no cultural power associated with it.
Well, and that's a good point because, again, not to let's just mention him again, Edward Dutton. So Edward Dutton had actually released a video not long ago about this very topic,
The
saying
priestly
that
cycle in higher education. Yep.
yeah, saying that, and a lot of people in our scene, even the guys from the NRX scene and the post NRX scene, they've made comments that the only purpose of universities and the universities that matter is to confer status. Like if you want to be an elite, you go to these schools. That's the only reason you go to them, even, and that's
Mm-hmm.
probably very, very true. But
Mm-hmm.
that is part of the tail end of the cycle because that status will go away as they just fill up with low
Right.
status people.
Exactly, because why do they have status? And they have status because they became concentrations of highly intelligent, genius IQ people who were doing interesting things. Even if your average person couldn't understand what they were doing, it was kind of cool that these smart people were there doing it. And every once in a while, something that was actually useful would come out of it. When it's all just nonsense, it loses status. And then there's no smart people there. Then the rich people are like, well, why do I want to send my kids to go study with a bunch of idiots? That seems pointless. And the rich people leave. And okay, now you don't have smart people or rich people. Well, like you're not going to have much in the way of prestige, are you? So, I mean, the one idea that occurred to me is that we do have this sort of ersatz academy, which is very rapidly self-organizing on the internet because you have an increasing number of people who either are getting locked out of the academy for political reasons, or they're just saying this is intolerable, fuck this, and just leaving on their own. And it's intellectually curious people are not doing the things they do because they get paid for it. It's because they like doing it, right? That's what makes them good at it in the first place. So okay, they leave, they start self-organizing on the internet, they continue doing what they were doing anyways, finding ways to support themselves if they can. So that there's a potential for the prestige factor there. The key thing that's missing, though, is the credentialization, because
Yes.
no one cares. Like, okay, like Ed Dutton, right? To go back to his example. So he puts out all these videos and explaining like Evo bio concepts and things like that. Really useful if you want to like learn about this stuff. He's a great guy to follow. He's a great instructor. And my understanding is he also will charge money for courses if you want to go more in depth. Probably, I haven't done it myself. They're probably good, but no one's going to give a shit that you did it. As it currently stands, what matters is what school did you go to. But employers are increasingly realizing that even a student who went to a top Ivy League school doesn't necessarily know shit from crushed raisins. That this is more of an indicator that they're well indoctrinated with the imperial grammar of woke than they are actually skilled or knowledgeable in what matters. But they're also not going to care that you watched a bunch of YouTube videos. So what one idea I've had is if you could have like an open source standardized testing system, which you don't need the government to set that up. You could do this privately, Um, and just have it to be like a very objective, subject specific kind of system. So you have it for like there's your Calc 2 and your algebra and geometry and your human evolution and biology. Like not like so it's not like SATs or GREs or tests like that. It's like subject specific at the level of like a university course or a high school course. And then how you learned the material is irrelevant. What matters is how did you score on that test. That would give employers an objective measure of how well someone has learned the material and how good of an employee they're likely to be. And that, I think, could prove sort of like if Peter Thiel is listening to this, right? Like, dude, like this is something you want to fund. This would be like the sort of keystone element in enabling that ersatz academy to provide the education it's capable of providing, while fully removing the prestige element from the legacy institutions.
And you know what's an interesting example of what we're talking about? At least this is my experience, and it'll be a Canadian example. But it was the example of University of Toronto, because I think a lot of
Oh
these
fuck,
uh,
fucking U of
bigger,
T.
like prestige universities like Yale and Princeton and Harvard, they'll hang on just by their reputation. But I know that a lot of employers, University of Toronto, for people who don't know, is like one of the biggest universities in Canada. It's in the top 3 of like our top universities in the country. But I know that University of Toronto does not have the luster that it used to have for the exact reasons that we're talking about right now.
It's a joke. Even when I went there, it was a joke. um, it yeah, no one cared. No one cared that you had a degree from U of T.
And there
You
was a
might as well have
time
gone.
there was a time when they did, though, too. That's the thing. It's like, but now, like a degree, and it's a big school. Like it's wealthy, and Queen's University is another. Queen's is one that likes to pretend it's Harvard, but even they.
The funny thing with Queens is that yeah, they think of themselves as Ivy League North, but you go anywhere outside Canada, they've never heard of Queen's University.
I know.
They're literally a legend in their own minds. Like,
But it's funny for people who don't know. It's in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, and like you go there, and the buildings are nice and they're regal, and it looks like a university that you'd want to go to in a movie or something. But like you said, it's a legend in its own mind, I think.
yeah, and that the buildings, the physical infrastructure, it's one of the things that's kind of the most tragic about it, because a lot of these universities do have really gorgeous campuses. Queens is certainly one of them. Western University, I think, also is really beautiful. A lot of the liberal arts colleges in the States, and people rag on them, but you go to the campuses and they're really pretty. It's a lot like the mainline churches, like the old Protestant denominations, like the Anglican Church or the Lutherans, and they have these gorgeous churches and cathedrals. And then you go inside, and it's like the Progress Pride flag is hanging down, over the stained glass windows, and there's like a literal dude with lipstick on who's like giving the benediction of Saint Floyd or something, and it's empty. There's no one. There's like the pews are completely empty. It's like everything beautiful and nice is in the hands of people who are hostile to our civilization and driving it into the ground. It's very depressing.
Yeah, and they think
But
it's
but
funny.
what happens is we regroup outside of that, basically build the parallel society, um, and when the time comes, generation from now, maybe not even doesn't even take that long, we ultimately just go back and we take those nice buildings for ourselves.
And I think that's the way to look at it, because I know some people, they roll their eyes when I start talking about this, about parallel societies and stuff. But I think you're asking the right questions, which is identifying what the universities and academia, high academia, represents, and figuring out ways to carve out new spaces for that. So if you can solve the question for education itself, plus the prestige, and I think answering the prestige question is more interesting. And I think the prestige
Yes.
question is a bit more within our grasp, more than people think it is.
Yes. And that's why I got interested in that credentialization question, right? Because people like to dump on universities for being credential mills because the credentials that come out of them are fake and gay. Right? Everyone knows it's like the scarecrow's university diploma. It doesn't mean he has a brain. That's the joke. But it actually serves a valuable function. Like in a functioning society, you don't want to have to grill your doctor about his knowledge of nutrition and human anatomy for 3 hours before you decide whether or not you can trust his advice. You want to be able to go into the doctor's office and have a reasonable assumption that this guy knows what he's doing. Right? Like that, and that's the purpose of the credential is you kind of outsource that skill check to people who can, who can do that test. The problem becomes when the system gets gamed, which is where we are now, where you can't trust any of the credentials, and then that's why you kind of roll your eyes at the credential mills. But the only serviceable answer that I see is, okay, that means you need a different way of credentialing. So, okay, figure out a different way of credentialing that's not in the hands of those people. And if it's more reliable than whatever they're using, their credential becomes worthless paper almost overnight. Probably not overnight, literally, like social change takes a bit of time, but it can happen very quickly. And, once that happens, the prestige that they command evaporates and it's in your hands now.
What's interesting and amusing, I would say, actually, is that the unintended consequence of them ruining the I don't even call them credential mills, because what they used to be was just credentializing institutions, but they're being ruined. So now people, even the libs, have necessarily become racist because now like you say, you don't trust doctors. So it's like if I see an Indian doctor come into a room or a black doctor, I can no longer assume that he's passed the exact same tests. However, if a white German doctor comes in, let's be honest, everyone's a bit more at ease, right? And if you don't want to do the doctor example, let's talk about the flying a plane example. Like at the end of the day, you have to trust. Okay, if it's a guy in a mustache, a white guy in a mustache, I know I'm going to land safely because I no longer trust the pilot's exams. I no longer trust any exams being given, and that's a problem.
You don't even need to go that far. I mean, like have you ever had the experience where you're going through an airport and you've got like 8 different custom desks you could go to, and you kind of like you scan them, and like 7 of them are hefty black women, and like one of them has like a middle-aged white guy, and you're like, which one is going to be faster? Yep.
And you know what? I'll be fair. I'll throw in Asian guys in there too. If I see an Asian
100%.
guy, I'm like,
yeah,
you know what? I'm going to nod respectfully at this guy, and I'm going to get in and out.
No, exactly. I mean, that's always it's one of the things I've always found most amusing in the left's characterization of racial realists as a bunch of white supremacists. And I'm like, every single one that I've known will tell you straight up that, on average, Asians, the evidence shows that Asians are a bit smarter than Europeans. And, generally we have no trouble going to Asians for professional services. We have no trouble living alongside them. It's definitely not an aspect. It's not white supremacy. It's just realism. Like, yeah, like they're civilized. They're smart. We can deal with them. It's fine.
There's that old Bill Burr joke that I'm not a huge fan of Bill Burr, obviously, these days, but he had this great joke that everyone's racist when they're walking on the street alone at night. It's like you pull everything away. It's like you see like a couple black guys walking towards you. I don't care what huge shit lib you are. You're going to cross the street, and you won't cross the street if it's 2 Asian guys walking towards you. That's just the lived reality. When the rubber meets the road, you can't escape that.
The funny thing is, I actually generally don't cross the street, but that's because I've been deadlifting for 6 years.
Yeah, well,
So
me too.
like,
Like, especially if you live in a city and you've lived in a city like I have, you learn to walk a certain way. Like, you just kind of
yep,
through osmosis get this like "don't
yep.
fuck with me" stance. You're not
Oh,
flexing,
totally.
but yeah,
And you know, if I pass that group of like, you know, three hood rat looking black guys on the street, like 100%, like I tense up a little bit. The adrenaline starts pumping. I start like, you know, my imagination starts like running through. Okay, if they jump at me, like, okay, what's my move? You know, kind of like prepping, battle prep. You know, but I think that even just doing that like puts out this kind of like radio signal emotionally that they pick up on, and they're like, all right, that's not a white guy I want to fuck with. Like, let's leave him alone, right? So, like, I've never actually had any problems. But yeah, like you're sort of, you know, typical like hollow chested shitlib. Like, yeah, they will totally get like super nervous and not know how to deal with it. It's really funny.
yeah,
They never
they'll go
admit
the
it.
other way. That the hollow chested white guy will try and befriend them as he's walking by, and they'll go, "What up, Black Lives Matter?" And like, even if I was a black guy, I would beat the shit out of that guy on principle.
Oh, they hate it. it's this is the other really funny thing that I've noticed in interracial interactions. I mean, you know, having spent a lot of time hanging out with like shitlib whites just because of my professional background. But you know, I've also hung out with a lot of more nationalist types who are pretty frank, shall we say, about their views on things. Is that when you're at the bar and you're interacting with people of the other race, I find very often it's like you're more sort of like nationalist type whites who actually get along with them better.
Oh
First of
yeah,
all, there's the based black man sort of stereotype, right? Where like on 9 out of 10 topics that don't involve race relations, you probably see things in a very similar way. Like they feel the same way about homosexuality and trannies and feminism and all the stuff that like white guys do, kind of instinctively, because black people are, let's face it, they're very instinctive people. Uh, but the other thing, and I think it's more fundamental, is that if you're just like an unapologetic white person who's just like, yeah, I'm white. I like white people. I like being white. I'm not going to apologize for being white. I am what I am. Then black people will usually sort of be like, oh, thank fucking God you're normal. Because there's something about that apologetic, cringing, shitlib attitude of like, oh, I'm so sorry for everything that my people have done to you, and then like that emotive way that they talk to them, the women especially. That I think they, well, I don't think this. Like I've had some of them just like straight up tell me that they don't trust it. It strikes them as fundamentally dishonest, uh, and they're like, okay, what kind of white trick are you pulling here, right? So like, it gets their back up, and you also have a certain contempt for it quite naturally. If someone's like coming up to you like some kind of cringing helot wanting to lick your boots, you're not going to respect or like this person, right? If someone approaches you with like a straight back, looks you in the eye, like doesn't try to start a fight with you or whatever, but is just kind of like, not backing down, they're like, all right, cool. Like, we can deal with this.
you walk in there, you got your Hitler mustache on, firm handshake, say billions must die. I tell you what, they'll like you for it. And to your point, let me just say, even a guy like David Duke, I know he would never do this, but we all know who David Duke is. We know we're familiar with him. If he wanted to, I'm not saying he would. If he wanted to, he could slay a cathedral of black pussy. If he has that power,
I've actually seen this dynamic like close up. There, good friend of mine is a I wouldn't even call her like a based black girl. Like she was like a full on BLM supporter and the whole bit, right? But we actually got along really well. She fucking hated liberal white women so much. It was really funny. But she ended up marrying a like conservative, gun toting, Trump voting, like Italian dude.
many such cases.
No, totally. That's the thing, right? Like ultimately, humans respect humans who respect themselves. And if you don't respect yourself, no one's going to respect you. And and they're not going to trust you either, because like, okay, like, what's the game here? Like, no one really doesn't respect themselves, right? Like, well, I mean, there's only two possibilities. Like, either they're really like that, in which case they're a fucking worm, and it's like, it's unseemly, or it's all an act, in which case they're a different kind of worm, right? And I think this is like the big thing that shitlib whites like really don't get.
I agree. There's one. I know you got to get going soon, actually, but there's a couple things I wanted to get back to before we go, if that's all possible, because I really wanted to
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
dive a little bit more into tonic masculinity, because there's something I wanted to bring up, and I think it ties a lot of this stuff together. Um, and I'm going to be careful when I say this, because I don't want to sound too mean to boomers. Now, I'm not one of these guys that lays every problem that we face now at the feet of the boomers, like a lot of people do.
No, but it's a
Even
fun
though
game to play. It really gets them wound up.
Yeah. Even though on our store we have a shirt that says every boomer is the antichrist. That I understand that will be used against me. However, that's a bit of a joke shirt. But
What is
I
this? What
find
is
that
this? What is this boomer love, man? You're cucking hard here. This is terrible.
I know, well, just because it's to me like this idea of an intergenerational war is very strange to me, and it doesn't seem to have
It's
it.
actually it's actually fucked. But the problem is the boomers invented it.
Exactly. But I honestly, and I'm saying this because I'm about to give boomers a bit of guff. But I find this idea of tonic masculinity or tonic masculinity almost the antidote to boomer masculinity. And I'll give an example from my own life, from the coin purse of dimes. It's my own grandfather, and who was an interesting guy, nothing loathsome about him. In Canadian terms, he would call himself a red Tory. So he's probably one of these socially liberal, fiscally conservative, the type of guy that can't
Right,
exist
right,
anymore. But he had a very boomerish form of masculinity that you would see a lot of older, especially white guys, but I think older guys do too, where they were very hands off with raising their children. And I remember because I went to culinary school first to learn how to cook. And I still like to cook, and I cook with my wife. We cook a lot at home and things like that. And he looked at a man cooking, and he kind of chuckled, and he would smuckle at that idea, like, "Oh, like I'm less of a man for cooking." But
that's fucking gay. That's fucking gay. Not. I'm not saying cooking is gay. Cooking is human. I'm saying that attitude is fucking gay.
exactly, and it's a survival thing too. Like what's that about? But that's a lot of guys in that generation had that. That's women's work. Similarly, spending time with your kids was women's work, and then
Mm,
they end up being like, why do my kids only see me as a resource provider, as a bank? And it's
right,
like, well, that happens. But
right.
to me, with my son on the way, it would never. And maybe this is just a generational thing, or being raised up in this community of crazies like us. But I'm like, the idea of raising my son and spending a lot of time with him to teach him lessons seems crucially important to me. The idea of just like being hands off and not giving a shit, I'm like, well, you that tells me you don't know much about the world. The world's a scary place. Why would it, unless you had no wisdom to impart? But the idea of your tonic masculinity, as you outlined in your piece, that I found this so fascinating, was one of the ways you define it is by caring about your community, helping your community. And I think that was absent with a lot of the boomers. And the idea of
Mm-hmm.
caring and being invested, not as a feminine characteristic, but as like a builder, as a leader. Is that an accurate assessment in your mind?
100%. 100%. And I totally agree with that assessment of the boomers. I mean, in fairness to them, they mostly grew up in this kind of very deracinated suburban environment where, there was no community. And they were raised on the kind of John Wayne cowboy individualism as the kind of masculine archetype, which emphasizes self reliance, which is important. You don't want to be the weak link in the chain, right? Um, but that level of individualism can become quite pathological, and with them, I think it did. Uh, and there's definitely a thing where the boomers just utterly failed to pass on really much of anything. So I know so many young guys who are kind of pissed that they weren't taught how to navigate with a map and compass. They weren't taught how to do like basic carpentry or engine mechanics or sort of like all of those kind of like life skill type things that their dads knew how to do because they learned it from their dads, and just never passed it on to their kids. And then you're kind of sitting around, you're 30 years old, you've never been taught to do any of this shit. You have to figure it out for yourself. A lot of guys don't even get to the point of like, maybe I should learn how to do this for myself. They're sort of useless. But even if you're motivated to not be useless, you get kind of frustrated because you're like, well, shit, I should have been taught how to do this when I was 15 years old, not sitting here when I'm 30 trying to figure it out from YouTube videos, right? So yeah, man, I am 100% there with you. Like that is, if you have a son, like that is essential. Like not just spending time with him playing video games or whatever, which is also good, but like taking him out, playing ball with him, taking him camping, showing him how to pitch a tent, showing him how to navigate in the woods, showing him how to do like just stuff, and like in the core, it's not just the specific skills you're passing on, many of which are, maybe not so useful in the modern world all the time. In the course of doing that, you're teaching him how to be a man because he's learning how to be a man from you. And like there's all of this implicit knowledge that gets passed on through that they're not going to get from the school system. They're not going to get from television, from the internet, any of it.
And another thing that I think is important, and this is sometimes when we come to these conclusions because we know what was missing in our youth. But one thing that I want, as I was reading your piece, it occurred to me that prioritizing failure and experimentation. And when I say experimentation, a lot of people's minds jump to like sexual experimentation. That's not what I mean at all, especially for young men. I meant the idea of like trying and failing and getting better. And I feel like a lot of that was lost in that generation as well, of saying that, not only is failure okay because you learn from failure, but when you're young, you should actually be trying stuff and failing to get better at it. It's going to be a lot of failure until you get great at something, but you should almost run towards that and enjoy that. You know what I mean? And you had another great point in another piece I had read. I think it was the Truth Hurts piece where you said like your history, because you're also in the military briefly as well. Your history of pushing through pain and the how important pain is to a developing man. And I think if you remove that pain and that almost like the love and getting used to pushing yourself through pain, that almost throws your entire life off its track. Would that be fair to say?
100%. Yeah. I mean, the main point I was making in Truth Hurts was that learning something that conflicts with your pre-existing beliefs, canonical example would be like confronting a shitlib with some kind of like race realism statistic or something, right? Like this conflicts. They get the cognitive dissonance. Like that can't be true because if it was true, then so much of what I believe, which is based on that, would have to be revised and their whole worldview, and they can't do it, right? The brain interprets contrary information as physical pain, and we live in this very comfortable world where we have climate controlled rooms, we have comfy chairs, we don't have to go out into the chicken coop and chase away a fucking rooster trying to attack us in order to get our eggs in the morning and then scrape the chicken shit off the egg before eating it. We can just go to the grocery store, and all of this comfort means that we're not used to physical pain nearly as much as our ancestors were. And I think, and this is just a theory, this is kind of like a Nietzschean, connection between like the body and the mind and the spirit, that if you're not used to that kind of physical pain, that actually makes you more averse to intellectual or mental pain, which makes it harder for you to revise incorrect beliefs about the world, especially ones which are relatively deeply seated, upon which many other beliefs are based. And I think to a degree, a lot of the insanity of the contemporary situation of all of these people who just cannot confront reality is because they can't deal with pain. Even the smallest thing is like agony to them. So given all of that, yeah, you like young men need to, boys especially boys, uh, when they're sort of coming out of the nursery stage, you know, going out into the homestead, going out into the wild wood, as my friend Doc Hammer put it. I'm going to shill another friend Substack here. He had this lovely little allegory called the Wild Wood, the homestead in the Wild Wood or something. Um, Kind of explaining like the roles played by mother and father in bringing a child to adulthood. If you don't learn to deal with pain, because you'll never be able to become an adult. You just can't, and then like you'll always be held back. You'll always be uh, unable to push yourself forward and do difficult things. The one metaphor I like to think of is weightlifting. Like anyone who's ever been in the gym for an extended period of time, who's like really gotten serious about it, knows that it hurts. Lifting weights is painful. Your muscles ache. But after a very short period of time, you actually learn to love it. You're like, oh yeah, my pecs are really stiff and sore right now. That means I had a great workout. Like you're almost proud of the pain. And by embracing it, by pushing forward into that, you get stronger and stronger over time.
I'm the same way because I work out pretty early in the morning, and I know if I'm walking through the office and I was doing squats that morning or something, and I've got just that feeling when you have squats legs, and I'm just
Oh yeah.
it kind of hurts to walk, but
And like
I
and
feel
like you're looking at the office chair and you're dreading sitting down because you're like, oh man.
yeah, but like you
Start.
said, you end up almost addicted to that. When if I haven't punched the
Mm-hmm.
bag for a while, my forearms will be sore. I'm like, this feels so cool. And you had an interesting, I think, in that very same piece, an implication that had never occurred to me before, but it was that perhaps a great many of the individuals in our scene who are like the most noteworthy have some kind of history of pain, not subjecting themselves to pain, but
Yes.
perhaps they had a history of something where they were subjected to it against their will, and
Yes.
now that
Yep.
affected them, not traumatized them, but it gets you used to in a way other people. And I think that must be, like you had said, and again, it never occurred to me, the reason that they can't psychologically deal with some of our ideas. And to us, they're not scary. They're not scary ideas. It would be strange for us to be scared by an idea, but to them,
When
it
you've
makes sense.
confronted something that's genuinely agonizing, then like small things don't matter to you so much anymore. It's like people who've gone through near death experiences. Like the small shit doesn't bother them, right? And for them, almost everything is small shit. And yeah, so like I mean, I've got several friends in our thing who I know pretty well, and I know their biographies, and like they have sustained earlier, and it was before they sort of got political, right? Before they started, really questioning stuff. And they sustained, like, in some cases, rather horrific injuries that were just like, I got nothing like I've ever gone through. And it was after that they would have, maybe some kind of inciting incident that got them to sort of ask an important question about the things that they had always assumed to be true. And rather than running away from that, as so many people do, they would sort of be like, well, but is it true? And they would push into it. And, next thing you know, uh, well, we all know the direction it goes, right? So yeah, that's speculation on my part. Like, I don't know how common that is, but there does seem to be a, a larger fraction than you would sort of expect, who would either had like physically traumatic things happen and emotionally traumatic things happen that they sort of successfully dealt with, maybe both, or have some experience, some background in extremely physically taxing activities like high performance athletics, like military training, um, these kinds of things. that seems to me to be a bit more common than you find in sort of the general population.
I agree with that. And before, I know we need to get going soon, but I just wanted to say before we go, I'd misspoke where I said you were briefly in the military. I did, that came out wrong. I didn't want to imply that your
Oh no,
military
no,
history was
no!
too short. But, I was
It
going
was
to say,
brief. It was only a few years.
no,
I
but a
really
few
don't want to
years and
exaggerate.
nothing. To me, brief would be someone who like goes through basic training and then drops out because I've seen that happen too. But I think if
Dude,
you,
I knew a guy in basic, and this I'll never stop laughing about this idiot. So in the Canadian military, for anyone who's never been in, you when you're doing basic training, the cat badge that they issue you for your beret is sort of a generic Canadian Forces cat badge because you are not yet good enough to have the unit cat badge. You only get that when you complete basic training, right? So there is this one retard in our basic training platoon who goes out on our first leave weekend 2 weeks into the course and gets the unit cap badge tattooed on his arm.
oh no.
Yeah, guess who dropped out?
Oh man, I thought you were going to say like he went to an army surplus store and got like a knockoff of the badge, did something like that. That's almost worse though.
Dude, it's so much worse. It's so much worse. It's like he's like walking. It's like a badge of shame for the rest of his life, reminding him that like, I'm not even sure. I'm not sure exactly why I dropped in. It's not like I was close to the guy or anything, but like he was a fuck up. That was obvious to all of us.
But you know,
So like,
you know what sucks though? He's probably out there right now at a bar, and a woman's like, "What's that tattoo mean?" He's like, "Yes, when I was in the military." And then she'll say, "Oh yeah." He's like, "I don't want to talk about it," and that's going to be good
God,
enough. Good enough for
good
that
God.
hoe.
I don't know. I almost hope he's like in like a tent city, like smoking meth or something
Yeah.
like that.
Well, it's right. The
It
point I was
sounds
going to
horrible,
make
but
was
like,
what's interesting though is when I was reading that, it made me think because military guys tend to be pretty big into our scene, and by our scene, it's a pretty broad scene. I group a lot of people like the trad cats and whatever on our side, the
yeah,
dissident right broadly. But I find military guys tend to obviously be more on our side. And I always thought people would say that's because they're so disciplined, and they are. But I'm also like, maybe it's also because they've been through shit in
mm-hmm,
training at whatever level they
mm-hmm.
were at, and that might be a factor of it too. That you've been pushed so hard that's essentially physical trauma getting through some of these courses and shit.
100%. If you have, if you have like, crawled through mud while live machine gun rounds are, firing over your head as you're trying to avoid getting your web gear caught on barbed wire, right? If you've done shit like that, yeah, someone saying that's racist is the volume gets turned way down. It's the Fight Club thing, right? Like after Edward Norton has been in Fight Club for like a few months, like, and his boss comes in to yammer at him about stupid shit, like he's just like, like uh, um, Charlie Brown teacher voice kind of thing. Like you just don't care as much anymore. It's not. Whereas like someone who has spent their entire life being coddled in a very soft, feminized school system and has never left it. Which, actually, to go back to academia, I think this is actually one of the huge problems, and probably one of the reasons why I am like one of the mutants on whom the conditioning didn't take is that I not only was having experiences outside academia, like being in the military, for instance, but I also spent several years outside of academia. Like I finished my undergrad and then I, went off and I taught English in Japan for, a few years, and I did a bunch of other stuff, manual labor, stuff like that. And, then I went back to grad school as a more mature student. And all of the other grad students that I knew, like they were of course much younger than me, and they had been in school continuously since they were like, what, 4 years old, like kindergarten all the way through to their PhDs.
And they'll
Um,
never leave.
they, well, I mean, right. Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, like, that's kind of their game plan. Right. But, I don't want to say like, oh, they don't know what the real world is like, but, they kind of don't actually. Like they've never really been challenged and that's not even fair because school can be challenging in the more difficult disciplines, but they've always been in a situation where their self-esteem is dependent on the approval of authority, on the pat on the head from teacher. And they've very rarely been in a situation where they were in some kind of physical danger or severe physical discomfort for an extended period of time or anything like that. And it makes them very emotionally soft, very neurotic, very overly concerned with the opinions of others, and therefore emotionally malleable, very tractable, very biddable as a result.
And what's interesting is nothing is contextualized because as I've gone through life and I've gotten into more, I got into boxing and I got into weight training and
Right,
I got into shooting. I do shotgun trap and skeet and stuff. And it's like the moment
nice.
and just like the trauma thing, it's like it allows you to contextualize things differently and refocus on things. But for these people, everything is the exact same level of trauma. But once you kind of experience real pain and become kind of tactical into how you live your life and a bit more disciplined, things like you had said, back to the Fight Club thing. I've always liked that movie, and it's more poignant than people give it credit for. But it's like letting things that don't matter truly slide. And for some people, nothing
Yes.
doesn't matter. They can't say anything doesn't matter. Everything has to matter. And I think that's a big difference between the sides as they're kind of talking across each other.
They
We
end up like Chat GPT being unable to distinguish between using a racial slur and nuking an entire city, right? Like better that
yeah,
billions die than like the N bomb get dropped, you know?
exactly. Anyway, I'm aware that you have to get going now. This has been a very good episode. I don't want to keep you too long. Is there any last points that you wanted to get across? We covered everything that I wanted to talk about. But was there anything that you really had burning a hole in your brain that you wanted to bring up?
Not really. Anyone who's interested, come check out my Substack, Postcards from Barsoom. And We recently started up a Slack for paying subscribers called Demos Station, where we're basically just on there like shit posting about like Curtis Yarvin and AI and demonology and God, like like all sorts of random stuff that weird autists like to talk about. So yeah, that's sort of my shilling, I guess, that I wanted to get off my chest.
And let me ask you this: is there a podcast? Because I'm looking at on your Substack a Martian Wonderland.
Oh yeah. So a few weeks ago, I started with my friend Jay Rollins. So Martian Wonderland. It's like because like post okay, so people who don't know their pulp weird fiction history, Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is where my nom de guerre comes from. John Carter of Mars. Barsoom is Mars, basically. And then Jay has the Wonderland rules. So he's like a social dynamicist, you might call him, sort of like an autist who had to teach himself the rules of social dynamics. And in the context of what is usually referred to as game, although he likes to refer to it as the dance, because he thinks that's a better framing that takes some of the psychopathy and like the sort of manipulative Machiavellianism out of pickup artistry and turns it into more of like, understood as like a sort of cooperative venture with the girl that you're talking to. And I actually think that's quite clever. So he does what he calls dance classes on his Substack. He's also like he's an editor and he's been in the literary world for some time. So we've been sort of going back and forth and hanging out over Substack for several months and decided to start this podcast where we just kind of bat different topics back and forth. It can get a little contentious at times because he came into the dissident sphere from a completely different direction. So he came at a stupid pole, right? So he's like he's not a Marxist, but he kind of came out of like the old left. And like so he has like the priors from that and like but he's very much like hates the identity politics stuff, wants to destroy the woke left, all of that. The tonic masculinity thing was actually his idea, I should say.
Oh,
And if yes, he was like, John, you got to write about this. This is a great idea. And I was like, actually, that is a good idea. Okay. Which if you go back and read the piece, like I give him a shout out there and like, stole the term from him basically. So yeah, that's a podcast we've been doing, but we're at the third episode. Well, second episode, because the first was episode 0. Got posted today. I don't know. People seem to like it. It's still new, so if your listeners want to see what the man from Mars and the based based Jewish editor have to say about these things, then it's I don't know. I'm having fun doing it.
that's great. Hey, I'm somewhat biased, but I think more people should be podcasting. I think I haven't had listened to this one yet, but I'm going to give it a shot. And I encourage everyone else to again, it's a Barsoom, Barsoom.substack.com is the place to go. Also, you can find yourself on Twitter. And there was another location as well.
And on if you
again?
look up like telegrams from Barsoom on Telegram, I'm there. I'm probably one of the few people who have more followers on my Telegram account than I have my Twitter account. Because my Twitter account, it's like I am a tadpole on Frog Twitter. I've got like 100 followers there. I just started it up.
Like I keep getting banned.
Yeah, that's why I got frustrated with Twitter. I was just like, I kept getting banned, and I was just like, and it just like wasn't worth it after a while. And then Daddy Musk bought it, and I was like, okay, maybe I'll have another look at this then. Could be I basically started the Twitter account up to try and use that to get more subscribers for my Substack. I've really been using the Substack more as like a social network than Twitter, which it turns out you can actually do fairly effectively. And I find it very interesting because like if you go to my Substack, you'll see that a lot of my pieces tend to get like a fair amount of engagement and pretty high quality engagement too. Like at the comment section, there's some commentators that I think I'm pretty sure are smarter than I am. Yeah, quite a few of them actually. And then I'll see other Substacks from sometimes relatively big names on Twitter that probably have more subscribers than I do, honestly. And like I've seen sometimes people like post their view count numbers and they actually blow me out of the water, but they'll have like 5 comments on the piece they do.
Yeah.
And I think that's because like the engagement you get from the Substack users, like they're very high quality subscribers who like actually want to go in there and comment and start a conversation. Whereas I think like maybe your typical Twitter user, they might read it, but they're not going to actually bother commenting on it or subscribing or things like that. Another friend of mine, he's been lucky enough to get boosted on Revolver a few times. This is Rolo Slavsky. This is Slavland Chronicles, mostly commenting on the Ukrainian war and sometimes talking about Christianity and metaphysics and stuff too. He's a really interesting. He's a great writer, a good friend of mine. And his view counts can blow mine out of the water when he gets boosted on Revolver, but he doesn't get any subs from it.
Yeah, that's something I'm very interested in, just because I like the marketing perspective about the types of audiences people get, because every audience has a flavor. And for some of these bigger names, they will have an audience that might be substantial, but doesn't like to engage with them. And that relationship is different. Whereas you could have
Exactly.
a smaller group of followers who are way, way more active and like engaging with you, and sometimes engaging in different ways. And though I think that one is better. I like that. I would rather have smaller and more active. And then sometimes they're active, negative versus positive. There's all different ways to do it. But that
Yeah,
people kind of get the audience.
that's what moderation is for, like so.
Yeah.
Anyone who does want to come into my comment section, it is always open, and I absolutely want to hear from you. But if you come in there with some kind of overly spicy username, like sorry, I'm probably going to suspend you. Like, you know, there's a dress code.
Yeah. Yeah. And probably the quality of the
You know,
discourse will go down.
this is the issue, right? It's a salon. It's meant for like, you know, interesting discussion. I I don't care what people say. You can say anything you want. I don't want people fighting and insulting each other, to keep it civilized. That's sort of like the thing. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like audience development, sort of the choice I made early on was to sort of go for like a more organic growth strategy where I would sort of like seek out those more like engaged, interested users by sort of basically promoting my Substack in the comment sections of other Substacks, reasoning that you know, people who read the comments are likely to also comment. And that turned out to actually work really well. Yeah. And it is interesting, like seeing how like the kind of like more Twitter centric Substackers, like they really don't get the same level of engagement, I find, unless they have like really huge Substacks. On the other hand, you know, it does give them more reach, you know, like I won't lie. I get a little jealous when I see someone's got like, you know, like 100,000 views on something and they just started it. I'm like, come on.
Well, it's interesting because you would point out something that I've noticed before that I don't know how to describe this, but there's almost like there's people who prefer certain types of platforms. I find the people who really love Twitter and prefer Twitter and are dying to
Yes.
stay on there, they
Yeah.
they're unable for that to cross over to long form, and they have a different sort of personality in a sense.
Yes, and there's a whole culture that's developed like around like Frog Twitter, for instance, that's like very. It doesn't work outside of Twitter so much. So I find like what a lot of them like they'll start a Substack. I think they get a fair number of their friends will go and read it, which is great. But I think like then like the conversation about the piece will largely then take place on Twitter. Like they don't bother with the comment section.
Yeah.
That's kind of which is fine. I mean, like, you know, it's people are writing interesting stuff and having those interesting conversations. And I think that's the most important thing ultimately, because as long as these conversations are taking place, we're developing what comes next, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of my main thing actually that I'm trying to do at Postcards from Barsoom is like not just complain about all the fucking problems, because God knows there's a lot of them. Not just say what we're against, you know, like really focus on what we're for.
That's what
Which
I'm most
shit, we did
excited
this
about in
whole
our scene.
interview and we didn't even get to that 2043 piece, and I heard you guys talking about that the other day. But we'll have to talk about that some other time, I think.
I know, yeah, because we didn't get to like. There's a lot of good posts on there, so people go and check that out. But yeah, my co-host was probably discussing it, and he really liked the piece too. I know the first one we saw was tonic masculinity, and my co-host liked it, and he's not a guy who usually likes things or people. He doesn't like me that much, and he liked that piece.
Yeah, he's the one who keeps hitting the billions must die button, if I
Yeah,
recall.
he's a political guy, but he is so pushed through to the edge, like he doesn't see any solution, and you can get a lot of fun ideas once you're out that far. But he's also like, he's a bit more closer to what you might think, where like he judges people by the strength of their character. He's big onto like, do
Uh-huh.
you have a family? Do you have a job? Are you a type of person I can who seems cool? Because if you're not, I want nothing to do with you at all because you're probably fucked up in some other way. So he's
Mm,
very like he wants to be a homesteader. He wants to go off grid like me. So he just wants to. I
that
joke that he's made me an ANCAP where I just want nukes and slaves. I'm just gonna be a nuke and slave guy, private military, whatever.
it's like that. It's like that meme with the ANCAP all meme, where like you know, you're at Thanksgiving dinner and your relative, and you say like the Second Amendment shall not be infringed, and you know your liberal aunt
Yep.
says, but what about nuclear weapons? And then like the next panel is like, you know, it's all like radioactive, and he's just like, shall not.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. It's like, oh, so you want to be like a meme? Yeah, I'm going to be a fucking meme. How about that? I'm going to be a retard.
I am all in favor of backyard nukes, man. Like, I've got a whole thing about how like molten salt reactors or thorium reactors or things like that, like this, like, you know, they didn't want to pursue this technology because that would actually lead to small scale self-sufficient communities. It didn't have to be on the grid, unlike things like solar power and wind power, which are fucking meme technologies.
Fuck. This is something we got to bring up next time I have you on, because this will be one of the many things we talk about. I want to hear about the reactors, but we do got to get going now. And I know you do, especially. So I'm going to say once again, thank you so much for taking the time to come on, Mr. Carter. And I hope to have you on again soon.
Dude, thank you so much for inviting me. I had a great time.
Yeah, me too. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, later.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.